Hello and welcome back to a new Planet Zoo video. So, I'm a little behind with the rankings for the Eurasia Pack animals. Life unfortunately does sometimes get in the way. Honestly, I'm so far behind, I figured I'd skip this pack, but you guys, my audience, well, you do have other ideas, and I have had a fair few comments asking where my usual ranking is. So, although I'm a little surprised there's such interest in my opinion of the animals, I figured if that's what you guys want to see, here it is. My ranking of the worst to best animals in the Eurasia Pack. As per my usual rankings, I'll be ranking each new animal based on a specific set of factors, so that's appeal, mating capabilities, upkeep costs, and versatility. Up first, we're looking at appeal. Appeal's based on how popular an animal is, so that can affect the number of visitors and visitor happiness. Taking a sample of new animals available in the trade centre, rankings for me are as follows. In last place is the mute swan. I of course love the swans, but when it comes to visitor appeal, they apparently disagree. I've got 50 swans in this enclosure, and most are around the mid to upper 700s for appeal, with a few reaching the upper 800s, but far and few between. In 7th place is the wild boar. The boars are coming in at an appeal rating around the upper 700s to the mid 800s, and that's really not a big difference to what the swans were reaching. The reason I've placed these above the swans is there was a little more consistency with reaching the mid to upper 800s range than there was for the swans. In 6th place is the Takin. Takins have an appeal ranging from around 1,100 to 1,300, so it is a little better than the previous animals, but it's still quite low in terms of what you can achieve for ratings in Planet Zoo. Coming next in 5th place is the Saiga, with an appeal rating of 1,600 to 2,000. It does surprise me because Saiga is a really unique creature. It does look like it's from another planet, so I would have assumed that would have given it a bit of a boost in the ratings, but it's coming in about average for what you see for the small hoofed animals. Anyway, in 4th place for appeal is the Wisent. Wisent is a mid-range appeal animal bringing in 1,900 to 2,300 appeal. So that brings us into the top 3 category. 3rd place, we've got the Hermann's Tortoise with an appeal rating of 2,300 to 2,500. That's pretty consistent with some of the highest appealing exhibit animals in the game. Exhibit animals, for the most part, tend to bring in pretty good appeal rating, so Hermann's Tortoise definitely being consistent with that. 2nd place goes to the Sloth Bear. All the bears in Planet Zoo, I think because they're a larger species and they're quite difficult to look after, they do bring in quite a high appeal rating. The Sloth Bears are no different. Their appeal is around 3,000 to 3,500. That brings us to 1st place, and if you haven't guessed already, the highest ranking animal for appeal in the Eurasia Pack is the Wolverine. Not that far behind the Sloth Bears, Wolverines will bring in an appeal ranging from about 3,000 to 3,600, so only very slightly better than the Sloth Bear, but narrowly beating them to 1st place. That's the appeal ranking for the Eurasia Pack animals. Next we're going on to mating, birth rate and the longevity of each species. This ranking gives a good indication of the turnover of a species and the micromanagement needed to maintain a population. Turning the tables, in 8th place is the Wolverine. Reasoning for this, you can only keep 2 Wolverines in an enclosure. They are an aggressive animal and they will fight if you have more than 2, so not a lot of opportunity for births at the outset. They do mature pretty quickly, only 2 years before they can start reproducing themselves, and a relatively long lifespan of 15 years, so not the greatest there, but not the worst either. Wolverines can produce up to 5 babies per pregnancy, but negative here, it will take 24 months until they can breed again after they've given birth. Something else to note, I did a trial run for this video with all of the new animals and checking how long it takes them to reproduce, how successful mating events are and whatnot, and honestly I had the worst trouble with the Wolverines here. It took a good few years before they even started mating, and then another couple of years before they had a successful mating event. All that combined together, I would say Wolverines do cause a bit of trouble in the reproduction department. In 7th place, I've put the Saiga. There is certainly better odds here than with the Wolverine because you can have one male breeding with up to 10 females at the same time. However, Saigas have a shorter lifespan of around 11 years, and there's still that really long 24 months between pregnancies. Saigas also have less babies, so only 1 to 2 per pregnancy, but I do feel the fact you can have many pregnancies going on at the same time puts them ahead of the Wolverine in that regard. In 6th place is the Sloth Bear. Sloth bears are another species that would rather be on their own, so only 2 bears allowed in the enclosure, and they take an extra year to mature, so that's 3 years to mature in total. What puts the sloth bear ahead of the others is they have a 35-year lifespan, so will be around for much longer, giving plenty of opportunity to breed. Sloth bears can also have 1 to 3 babies per pregnancy, and in my testing they were averaging about 2 babies per pregnancy consistently. In 5th place, I've put the Wisent. They have a shorter lifespan than the sloth bears, with death occurring around 21 years, although they won't produce after 20 years, so they take that last year for retirement, I think. Again, the Wisent takes 24 months between pregnancies, and you'll be seeing 1 to 3 births per pregnancy. The reason the Wisents are in 5th is that you can breed them for a very long time, and you can have a herd of 1 male to 12 females here. So overall, with a pretty long lifespan and lots of Wisents in the same habitat, overall you're probably going to be more successful with breeding than the sloth bear. In 4th place is the Takin. Really not a lot of difference in the stats with the Wisent. They are almost identical as far as I could tell. The only difference, you can have 19 females per 1 male, and the time between pregnancies is shortened to 12 months rather than the 24. 3rd place goes to the wild boar. With up to 29 females in an enclosure, an 11-year reproductive period, and the boars producing 2 to 5 offspring per pregnancy, that's certainly a recipe for many, many baby boars. 2nd place goes to the mute swan. For the swans, their ranking is bumped up by the sheer volume of swans you can have in a habitat. You can keep up to 50 swans in one go, and believe me, they will all start reproducing pretty much straight away. One issue for the swans, they are monogamous, so they will only breed with one other swan at a time. Still doesn't seem to stop them being baby-making machines. Like the boars, the swans also produce 2 to 5 offspring at a time. However, they're also fertile for a much longer period, living for 30 years and can reproduce right up to death. That brings us to 1st place, and that goes to the Hermann's tortoise. Like the other tortoise species in the game, they live an extremely long life, and that certainly boosts their numbers significantly. Although the tortoises won't start breeding until 12 years of age, they live for a whopping 90 years. And that equates to a 78-year breeding window. Couple that with the fact they are promiscuous, and they can live with up to 16 other tortoises at a time, as well as producing 2 to 5 offspring per birth. You've got a ridiculous potential for extremely fast population explosion. The next ranking is to do with upkeep and maintenance. For this, I've assessed the cost of upkeep, which is essentially just the food costs for each animal. This is based on maximum capacity for each enclosure, so food for the most animals you can keep in an enclosure. In 8th place is the sloth bear, costing a whopping $720 per animal per feed. Considering the sloth bear, although it is an omnivore, it favours a diet of nuts, seeds and fruits. So why is it costing $720 per feed? Do they have a special diet or something that needs importing from their country of origin? Who knows? They're just very, very expensive to feed. 7th place goes to the Wisent. This is a diet of mostly hay, and it will cost you $290 per animal. Again, is this some special kind of hay? Do they eat an astronomical amount of it or something? There's other animals in this list that eat exactly the same diet, and it's nowhere near that expensive, so I don't know, that's just where they place. 6th place goes to the Wolverine. They do eat meat, which traditionally is more expensive in Planet Zoo to figure out than the fruits and vegetables. However, when you break it down, between 2 Wolverines per enclosure, that's a $203 per feed cost. 5th place goes to the Takin. There's a significant drop from this point, with mostly hay here, and considering how alike they are to the Wisent in their diet, the Takin cost per feed is just $45. A huge difference there, and not really any reason why. 4th place for upkeep costs go to the wild boar. Not much of a cost difference here, the wild boars will cost $40.20 per feed. From this point, we're getting into the super savers in terms of cost of food. 3rd place goes to the Saiga, with a very cheap upkeep cost of $20 per animal. 2nd place goes to the mute swan. They're the cheapest habitat animal, costing just $9.60 per feed for each swan. first place, which may be a little bit of a cheat here, it's the Hermann's tortoise, simply because the tortoise is an exhibit animal. Exhibit animals don't cost anything to feed in Planet Zoo, it's just not a mechanic in the game, so certainly a win by default there, although the tortoises are very small, so maybe if there was a cost for feeding them in the game, it still probably wouldn't come out at very much. Anyway, with costs out the way, that brings us to the final ranking in this list, and that's for habitat versatility. For this, I'm measuring things like the habitat size, confidence, and the interspecies enrichment. Now, this is the most subjective of the rankings that I've done today. It's unavoidable that there is a little personal preference will influence what you choose here. For me, I prefer smaller habitats because they're easier to look after, take less time for the keepers to get about. I also prefer the confident animals because they cause less trouble, and there's no denying that interspecies enrichment bonus is pretty good if you can get it. So in 8th place, I've got the Hermann's tortoise because being an exhibit animal, there's literally no versatility. You get a box and that's what you're stuck with. Granted, you don't get any of the pain points, but you don't get any of the benefits either purely because it's a static exhibit box. 7th place is the Saiga. Saigas, for a full group, you need around 1,000 meters squared to fit them in, which does feel quite spacious. Building this enclosure, they were a bit fussy about the amount of hard shelter they needed, hence why I've had to put in this big canopy inside here to meet the requirements. I'd rather have the enclosure without this because it's bulky and kind of gets in the way, but this is the minimum amount of hard shelter that the Saigas are happy with, so we have to stick with it. Something else not going in the Saiga's favour is that they're a shy animal, and if you're playing with animal welfare turned on, it's just a massive hassle, I think, for every time you get a shy animal. They'll always pop up with problems, even if you give them plenty of space and places to hide, they never seem to use it properly, so you're stuck using the big bulky one-way glass. I found that's the only surefire way to stop those problems happening. In 6th place, I've got the Takin. They need around 1,800 meters squared for a full enclosure, so again, this is quite a spacious habitat once you've got everything in there. What does go in favour of the Takin is they are neutral with humans, so no need for any special barriers, and you shouldn't see any problems with them getting stressed out. For 5th place, I've got the Wisent. Wisents are also neutral to humans, and an added bonus, you can get an interspecies enrichment with 4 other animals. So big plus point there for the Wisent. What pulls the Wisent down a little is the space requirements. I know, it's not their fault, they are a big haired animal, so yes, they do need a lot of space, but this comes in at 2,000 meters squared for an average group of Wisents. 4th place goes to the Sloth Bear. We're dropping back down to 1,000 meters squared here for the Sloth Bears, so it is a lot smaller than the Wisents. However, I feel like to do justice for the Sloth Bears, you want to make the enclosure a little mountainous, so you're probably going to have lots of rocks in here and lots of climbing frames. Now, I learned this the hard way many years ago. Any non-navigable area in your enclosure won't count towards meeting their space needs. So unless you're going to have a boring flat enclosure, that 1,000 meters squared to meet the space requirements could easily be doubled into 2,000 once you've got rocks and stuff in. So yes, technically the space could be smaller, but I think it would look pretty awful. 3rd place goes to the mute swan. Mute swans are a confident species, so will likely never get overwhelmed from guests gawking at them. They also get the interspecies bonus with 4 other animals. And I felt with the swans, they don't need a high barrier or anything like that. They're pretty good with lots of flora and fauna in the enclosure, so you can get quite creative with that. Only downside for the swans is the size. For a full enclosure of 50 swans plus the many babies that they're going to produce, you're looking at a minimum of 2,000 meters squared space. Partially that's taken up by their water need, which is separate from their terrain need, so don't forget that. I've also found when you need water in an enclosure, putting any decoration of plants or whatnot around the sides, that eats into the navigable area. Again, that causes issues, and you might end up having to make a lot more water than you think you need. Hence why the swans are placing 3rd for this. 2nd place, I've given this to the Wolverine. Reason for this is the Wolverines need the least amount of space at just 800 meters squared for the adults and an average number of babies. It did surprise me somewhat because I assumed with the Wolverines being forest animals, they would probably need a lot of room to roam. So it was a nice surprise that they could have a relatively small enclosure. The Wolverines are also neutral to humans, so not many difficulties with figuring out the fencing for them. And I found they didn't need a lot of space for their hard shelter either, so that was quite easy to tuck into the back of this habitat here. That brings us to the top spot for this ranking, and that goes to the wild boar. With so many boars in an enclosure, I'm surprised they don't need more space. For a full set of boars and a complement of babies, you would only need around 900 metres. And I think that's really good considering how busy the enclosure is. The boars are a confident animal, so absolutely no problems with the barrier type. And to top it all off, the boars also get that 4 interspecies enrichment bonus, so a win there for the boars. That brings us to the overall scoring. To add all this up, what I do is I take each category, I list the animals 8 to 1, and then I add up the scores. The animals with the lowest scores obviously are the winners, and the animals with the highest scores overall are the losers. 8th place, that goes to the Saiga. Unfortunately for the Saiga, they scored lower on most categories aside from the food cost. I can't help but feel bad for them because they're a great addition to the game and they look so good and different. But when it comes down to gameplay mechanics, they're just nothing to stand out with, so unfortunately that leaves them in last place. Next, we have a tie. In joint 7th and 6th place, just 1 point behind the Saiga, is the Takin and the Wisent. There was some categories each of these animals scored okay in, but there was also some that they scored quite badly in. So unfortunately for both of them, not pulling out any top points for any exceptional qualities here. 5th place goes to the Sloth Bear. Again, just 1 point behind the Saiga and Takin. I do think the Sloth Bear does have some great qualities, but there's nothing setting them out above the rest, so that really brings them in on an average in 5th place. 4th place goes to the Wolverine. They've had mostly good scores across all the categories, just a few negatives here or there letting them down, especially that breeding one. Next, there is another tie. That's the first time I think we've had 2 ties in one scoring here. 3rd and 2nd place goes to the mute swan and the wild boar. I think both species have some really good qualities and they're always going to be a great addition to any zoo. They just don't beat out the animal that's sitting in number 1 spot. Just like my last ranking review, the number 1 spot goes to the exhibit animal. Reason being, you just can't argue with some of the statistics. The Hermann's tortoise is really easy to look after and you're going to get a huge bonus with all of the appeal that a full exhibit is going to bring in. Not only that, but there's pretty much a 0 chance that you will end up with an empty box because they are going to be breeding constantly. I think the Hermann's tortoise is a justified winner above all of the habitat animals, even without that win they had by default because they don't cost anything to run. So there you go. For everyone that was asking about the ranking video, I hope this satisfies. I'm sure some of you might disagree with the rankings, but I did really try not to be subjective here, especially as my favourite animal, obviously the swan, is in the group too. So that said, if you do disagree with any of the results, feel free to let me know in the comments. I don't think it'll change my opinion, but it is nice to know what others think too. Thanks so much for watching, I'll catch you in the next video.